Friends, let's kick this off a little bit different. Let's put the car aside for just a second and nerd out. Last year, Ford sold about 760,000 F-150s, Toyota sold about 450,000 Camrys, and Chevy sold about 50,000 Corvettes. But in that same period of time, you guys bought 120,000 of these B-segment crossovers. This year, this same segment is on track for almost 300,000. And these are cars like Buick Encores, Nissan Juke, and Chevrolet Trax. Cars, frankly, that are about value in numbers, not fun. Now, let's go back to the car. Mazda is coming to the party. So the question is, can a segment that is about value in numbers be about fun? So when you and I geek out about engines, normally I have a lot of numbers to memorize, but that is not the case here because the horsepower and torque are exactly the same, 146. On the horsepower side, it comes in at a relatively aggressive 6,000 RPM, but on the torque side, that's where things become interesting because it comes in at 2,800 RPM. And as a basis of comparison, other 2-liter 4-cylinder engines, that comes in generally like 4,000 and 5,000 RPM. And as a further basis of comparison, those V8 twin-turbo monsters we've been driving as of late, that's like 1,400 RPM. So it's impressive from this little engine, but how do they do that? Now, this thing has Skyactiv splattered all over it. Mean Gene went over that somewhat of a deep dive a couple of years ago, so you can check that out. But there are really two things that stand out here, and that is a higher compression ratio. In the exhaust manifold, they call it the 4:2:1. We would call it a bundle of snakes. And really, the trick here is how it deals with the expent exhaust gases. That's the theory, at least. But really, how does that translate out on the road? Okay, so admittedly, not the most horsepower and torque you and I have ever driven, but this is a B-segment car, and who the hell really buys one of these things for horsepower and torque? If I were to poll everyone who bought like a Buick Encore, a Nissan Juke last year, and say, on a scale of 1 to 10, where does horsepower and torque fall? I would say collectively, they would answer 28. But with that, you and our car guys, so we kind of got to unpack horsepower and torque. And the good news here is it more than gets out of its own way. And that's a big function of what we discussed in that Scion IA film, which is a higher compression ratio. Now, this is not the same engine. This is a bigger engine. This is the 2-liter. But it's also that bundle of snakes thing that I showed you. That's how this thing can get the torque, the 146, to come in at a lower point, 2,800, and that's what makes this thing actually fun to drive, whether it's around town or here. Now, we've been fortunate to drive this thing literally in our backyard in Top Secret Moto Canyon, and I'll be honest, I've been playing around with this thing in the sport mode with the transmission to get the most out of it. And the good news is you have more fun. The bad news is you're going to have a hit to the fuel economy on these things. So let's kind of get that out of the way, because fuel economy, that's why people buy these things. And the front-wheel drive, so the two-wheel drive model, it is 29 and 35, but the all-wheel drive, which this is 27 and 32. Okay, we've nerded out a lot thus far, so let's do some more. This time, design and engineering. So this is actually taller than the larger 3. It is longer than the 2 on which it's based. There are more horizontal lines that's supposed to make it look longer. And notice this belt line is taller. And then engineering-wise, there are larger wheels. The transmission is physically smaller than that of the 2 and the 3. Now, interesting note, I asked the grand poobah of Mazda about a manual transmission, and I didn't get a no. They said they're monitoring this situation. So you know what that means. Comments below or via our social media. But I digress. Back to engineering. The track in the rear is wider, and then get this. So we've talked about this Skyactiv stuff before. Go back to some of our older films to learn more about it. But the general idea is to save some weight. So they spent just a wee bit of that weight on thicker steel and more sound deadening equipment. So that's all fine and good, but how does that translate to the road? This is the part of our story where I have to giggle because the terms driving dynamics and B-segment cars or crossovers generally don't exist in the same sentence. And we have to roll back to that Scion IA film because that car kind of knocked us on our ass because it was so much fun to drive. You're probably asking yourself, why the hell are we talking about a Scion, a Toyota product, and a Mazda film? Well, that car is designed, engineered, and built by Mazda. It's sold around the world as a Mazda, except for the US where it's sold as a Scion. Get it? This CX3, many of the bits that create this vehicle come from that vehicle. Get it? So to really unpack driving dynamics of the CX3, we need to look at the rear suspension of the IA or the worldwide Mazda. And unlike the Mazda 3, it's not one of these very cool sort of multi-link independent rear suspensions that really make that car drive awesome. Instead, this is a torsion beam. Now, if I'm being honest, I'm not very excited about a torsion beam. But what they did in the Scion IA, I don't know how they did it, there is composure and stability there. And one of the reasons they do it is the trailing arms in that thing, instead of being like this, where they're kind of parallel with the road, they're like at an angle like this. And the idea is to have the wheels be less disturbed by broken pavement, turns, that kind of stuff. Well, here you have the same kind of trailing arm here, but because of the added weight, and it really isn't a huge amount of weight, but you do have some added weight and a taller vehicle, you get a lot more body roll and a little less stability. Now, driving this thing around town, are you really going to notice it? Probably not. But if you take it out here, yeah, you will notice this kind of stuff. Now, why did they do this setup as opposed to the fancy multi-link thing in the 3? Well, there's really two reasons, and that's a trade-off. Number one, this is a lower price point vehicle, so you're just going to save money by having less parts. And number two, this thing is, who's going to buy it? It's going to be like hipsters that are going to go to like the food co-op to get like the farm-to-table organic pumpkin, so they need a lower load floor, and by having a slimmer rear suspension, you get that lower load floor. Get it? Now, you and I normally spend a lot of time out here waxing on about the details of fancy, expensive cars. You're probably wondering, why do we never do this for cars that are not expensive? Well, cars that are not expensive usually don't have very cool details. This is a bit of an exception, and it really falls under three headings. Number one, color. You can actually get a color in there that is not black, believe it or not, and it extends to places beyond the seats. Number two, textures. Like, for example, look at this suede-like stuff here, and then even that extends down to the stitching here. Like, do you remember when Cadillac first introduced this a couple of years ago called Cut and Sew? It was the first manufacturer that wasn't 200 grand to give you this kind of stitching. This goes a bit beyond that by offering different colors depending on the color of the interior. And then there's what I would call a splash, and that's this kind of detail here. Look at the armrest, the center console, the shift boot. There is a red piece of trim in the center of the shift boot, and then depending on the model you choose, the bezel around the vent is red. So not an expensive car, but it has details. So I recently drove the Mazda 6 with a new interior, and that car is completely transformed. It's like it's finally got the interior that was intended for that stunning exterior. Now that whole idea has been transformed here, but this is hard to do because how many designers have we had on the show where they talk about proportions? It's all about proportions, and that's not marketing mumbo jumbo. That is real design like ethos. Because if the proportions aren't right, that's why designs look weird. That's why B-segment cars kind of look stubby. But it's harder on the interior because, think, this is a more compact place to be. But what these guys have done is they've changed. They've made it more, the lines horizontal. They've made the dashboard lower. They've put some different color. Like in the Scion, there was no color. In the Scion version, the dash is the same, but this was black and black here. Yeah, you had the stitching was a different color, but by putting a splash of color here, here, and here, this is a much more pleasant place to be. This one over the Scion, it's got the head-up display, which love. I don't know why this isn't just something that is from like government mandate because it's a safety thing, but it's also just my geek side. I love it. Now here's somewhat of an odd unintended effect. So they went so far as to putting in all this color in here and some design tricks and different textures, like you got like a suede-like thing here. You got the stitching that actually they offered the stitching in different colors. This is actually a nicer place to be than the CX5. So there's another really important point we need to cover here, and it's kind of odd that we're covering it on like a 90-degree day with very high humidity in Southern California. That's incredibly rare here. And that is the part-time all-wheel drive system. So most of these cars, the Juke, cars like this, all have some sort of all-wheel drive system. And what they usually do is a wheel will send slip, and then it'll send traction to another wheel to kind of make up for it. Well, the Mazda engineers tell me that this is a predictive system, not a reactive system. I'm like, okay, that's great. What the hell does that mean? And their logic is they're thinking, let's get traction to the other wheels before we know we need it. I'm like, okay. Short of a $250,000 Mercedes, I have not seen a $20,000 car that has stereo cameras that read the road. So what they do is they have more points of input. So things like, are the wipers on? Or what's the speed of the vehicle? Or steering input? Or has the wheels lost traction some other point? And it kind of computes all that in like its internal abacus, and then it sends the traction to the wheels that it thinks it needs to be at, thus making the vehicle more stable. Now I'm thinking we might need to get this thing back in like snow and try that, but that's what the system does. So in summary, what do we got? Well, we started out this film nerding out about segments, value, and numbers. Then we jumped in the car and drove. And really the best way to encapsulate this little exercise is to go back to a spectrum we came up with on one of our subcompact car films, and that's a driving dynamic spectrum. We took cars like the Hyundai Elantra and the Mazda 3 and put them on a driving dynamic scale, and surprise, surprise, the Hyundai was kind of at the bottom and the Mazda 3 was kind of at the top. Then we went over to the subcompact world, and it was the Nissan Versa at the bottom and the Scion IA Mazda 2 on the top. But now we're going to the subcompact crossover B segment area, and I would say that spectrum is still very much the same. And with that, I want to leave you guys with a question. I personally am a guy that only drives sports cars with manual transmissions. Cars that have practicality, that's kind of against my religion. So I would love to understand why people buy these. Like, what is the purchase decision? What do you do with it? So if you want one of these, if you are going to buy one of these, or if you already own one of these, and when I say these, I mean cars in this segment, why did you buy it? What was the reason you bought this vehicle? Let me know in the comments below or via our social media, MotoManTV all one word, MotoManTV all one word. And until next time, I say, bis später.